In the previous two parts of this in-depth analysis series, an exposition of Mirror's conception has been provided, from the first drafts and early texts, to the shooting and editing table stages, afterwards delving into the film's disparate reception, both home and abroad, and detailing the obstacles faced by Arseny Tarkovsky during and after production. By the end of part 2, a rough sketch of the film's notoriously Delphic narrative structure has been produced, with the expectation it would facilitate the connection of the assorted episodes for the audience. Nevertheless, there are still plentiful scenes and elements in the film that resist interpretation, and whose nature is bound to remain an enigma not only for foreign viewers, but perhaps even for native Russians as well, and which therefore require a wider, more full-bodied incursion, as well as an acquaintance with Tarkovsky's upbringing and personality in order to be thoroughly grasped. We shall now bring ourselves to a more minute and attentive observation of the film, following its natural blooming from the very first scene, before even the credits are spread over the screen, in an attempt to get the viewer more actively invested in Tarkovsky's Mirror. In this first scene of Zerkalo, Ignat shows up, turning up a TV set, and leading the audience into a program in which a speech therapist is seen curing a young, stuttering man. This scene by itself has tremendous power, especially when one understands that it is actual, unrehearsed footage of a session that Tarkovsky shot specifically for this film. Indeed, despite being shot in a poetic style that is declaredly Tarkovskian, through a long, uncut single take, with smooth camera panning, unhurried zooms that are driven to tight upper body framing and then nonchalantly reversed, as well as containing thoughtful lighting, the fact that one is witnessing an actual healing confers to the scene a beguiling rawness and uplifting energy. When the therapist orders the young man to speak loudly and clearly, freely and lightly, and he proceeds to do just that, it's an ecstatic and liberating moment that echoes Tarkovsky's search for his own cinematic language and newfound ability to speak through this medium. Although Ivan's Childhood, Andrei Rublev and Solaris are all outstanding films on their own, at the same time they are films whose structure and presentation are somewhat tied to a conventional and even typical cinematic framework, especially from a dramaturgic standpoint, notwithstanding the occasional poetic forays that, for more attentive eyes, already hinted at a possible future stylistic outburst. In that sense, Mirror marks a departure, a break, one perhaps may even say a healing from the more prosaic aspects of filmmaking, for with Mirror, Tarkovsky himself is now able to also speak plainly and purely, with his genuine inner voice, without impediment, concern, nor shame. Here lies the key to unlock his apparently disconnected, cryptic first scene, which in its essence shares the same purpose of establishing the raison d'être in Tarkovsky's mind, much like the scene in his last work, The Sacrifice, when a little man regains his speech, this time not at the beginning but at the end of the work, an apt closure for the Russian filmmaker's legacy. After the opening credits that follow the speech therapy scene, the spectator is introduced to Maria, Alexei's mother. She is played with candor and sensibility by Margarita Terehova and is one of the few elements of the film that, as we have seen, has been accepted and praised right from the start, without exception. The scene contains one of the most iconic pictures in the film and may be taken as representative of the entire work for the way Maria is portrayed amidst the sober and warm surroundings of her Russian dacha by the woods, at sunset, with the camera leisurely approaching and orbiting her, as if to entice and inviting the viewer to step into this charming world, and the scene effectively succeeds in seductively pulling the spectator into this lyrical remembrance drawn directly from Tarkovsky's memories. Tarkovsky's mother, also called Maria, with Ivanova as patronymic, much like Maria in Zerkalo, had been left to take care of the children when the husband abandoned the family and shortly afterwards joined the army during World War II. While conversing with his friend Tonino Guerra some years later, he shared with him that he recalled quite well how on one occasion his mother awaited his father Arseny to come back from the city, and that was the source for this episode which, once reshaped and adapted to Zerkalo's narrative, crystallizes so well the forlorn sentiment experienced by Maria as she waits for her husband's return, a wait that seems to have no end in sight and which might last for the whole eternity and a day. As a curiosity, observe how this actual photograph of Tarkovsky's mother in Zavraje, where the family lived many years during his youth, is so reminiscent of her depiction in Zerkalo, no doubt having served as inspiration for his visual reconstruction in the film. Unlike the scene that happens in the film, where Maria is joined by a traveling doctor that engages in conversation with her, Tarkovsky remembers her mother in fact being approached instead by musicians from the neighboring village, with them inclusively dropping some hints at her, which she immediately and resolutely shut down without hesitation. Tarkovsky's subject transformation is based on the fact that he wished to weave a memory of yearning for his father and wrote the role of the doctor specifically to get his favorite actor in the movie, Anatoly Solonitsyn, in fact one of the finest Russian actors in history, which had appeared already in Andrei Rublev and Solaris as well, and this scene has the particularity of featuring the first direct verbal intellectual digression of sustenance in the film, focusing on a theme that, albeit having floated vividly in previous films, finds a direct reference now and is further explored in upcoming films, more precisely the autonomous character and consciousness attributed to nature. The representation of nature in most Tarkovsky's films is almost pantheistic, always sprightly, fecund and fertile, despite most of his characters appearing to be completely oblivious to it, and as per Orthodox Christian theology, it's also inherently good and essential to the divine plan, therefore differing from its Catholic counterpart. In Zerkalo, the Doctor, a notable exception, describes nature as an entity which mankind should look up to and draw inspiration from its demeanor and poise, reflecting on the nature's sensible understanding of itself, its world, and the stimuli derived from its sense perception, even if rooted in a wholly different level from the rationalistic bent so typical of the human outlook, whose tendency would probably be to describe it as limited at best and non-existent at all at worst. A reading of Takuan Soho's thoughts, a Japanese Buddhist monk from the 17th century, will provide unforeseen insights into the observations of the Doctor in Zerkalo and assuredly supplement the viewer's perspective on the theme. To say that plants have no pain or suffering is, from a human standpoint, a preconceived judgment. In fact, both pain and sorrow naturally manifest in them. The semblance of pain in plants and trees does not differ from the expression of suffering in human beings. When they are watered and taken care of, they grow up and appear happy. When they are cut and fall, the decay of their leaves is similar to the death of a person. Their pain and suffering are not known by man. And, when plants and trees observe the sorrow of human beings, the same happens to them. It is possible that they also think we do not hold pain or suffering. This is due to a simple reason. We are not aware of the lives of plants and trees, and in turn, they are not aware of ours. Tarkovsky seems to share of Takuan Soho's viewpoint, as voiced by the Doctor in Zerkalo, when he tells Maria that plants can feel, know and comprehend, and not only that, but he goes as far as saying that we ought to learn from them perhaps, and from their refusal to rush, fuss about and spout trivialities, that we should relinquish our suspicion and haste, and find the time to stop and think, a much cherished concept in Buddhism as well. Ji Yi, a Chinese Buddhist master of the 6th century, is mostly known for his systematization of Buddhist thought presented in his magnum opus, Great Treatise on Concentration and Insight, in which his understanding of stopping and thinking, or stopping and seeing for a more faithful description, is presented. In there, he concisely outlines his thought as such. The non-existence of arousal or obstruction is seeing, while the quiescence of the essence is stopping. Stopping and seeing is enlightenment. Enlightenment is stopping and seeing. In a more detailed manner, and perhaps in a tune that would have found agreement with Tarkovsky, he goes on to say that each datum of sense includes all phenomena. The same is true of all states of mind. This is called the nominal identity. This is the mind of enlightenment. This is also nominal stopping and seeing. Being tranquil is called stopping. Being aware is called seeing. In the end, the Doctor in Zerkalo is actually voicing a perspective that may seem fanciful or superstitious to overly practical or pragmatic minds, and which effectively seems to encounter some sort of resistance from Maria, but nevertheless echoes a tradition of wisdom and spiritual cultivation that goes back for several millennia. And what better way to symbolize the essence of this discourse than with that astounding scene that closes the interaction between Maria and the Doctor, as the former watches the latter depart into the distance, whilst the wind suddenly picks up and appears to bring their world into a rapturous, overwhelming sense of living unicity, of transcendental connectedness between the character subjects and their enveloping natural life. The fact that this image, certainly one of the most memorable of the entirety of Tarkovsky's career, happens twice in sequential fashion, almost even seems to point us to the perception of the observer and the observed, As if by showing us the event twice in a row, one becomes aware that the scene is witnessed both from the point of view of the human subjects and from the surrounding world. It seems then that the boundaries between both are dissolved, arising afterwards an understanding of the oneness that enjoins humans together with all other living beings that share the world with us. Yet, before their conversation had reached this section, the soliloquy by the doctor interestingly led to the first of various literary references in the film, this time resulting in the mention of Chekhov's famous short story Ward No. 6, exactly derived from Maria's apprehension during this sudden monologue by the doctor. Anton Chekhov, as one of the most renowned literary figures in Russian history, indeed one that found as much recognition and devotion on the rest of the Western Hemisphere, easily finds himself inserted into Tarkovsky's cinematic artwork through a tiny indirect verbal reference, but one which is duly applied to characterize Maria and her reasonable skepticism and no-nonsense approach, despite her endlessly hopeful expectations. In Ward No. 6, a rural doctor responsible for a psychiatric asylum and its small group of patients, frustrated with the dearth of culture and intellectual substance in his surroundings, is one day struck by an unexpected, more substantial conversation on the theme of suffering with one of his patients. The doctor in Ward No. 6 eventually becomes insane and ends up committed to the asylum himself, his apparent descent into madness being deftly portrayed by Chekhov, and the outcome in that story is employed by Maria to retort against the doctor in Zerkalo, expressing her wariness and caution towards him after he shared some of his profound, albeit unexpected musings on nature with her. If you have watched the previous in-depth exploration of Tarkovsky's nostalgia on this channel, at one point it's mentioned the debate between madness and sanity, its subjective distinction and varying perception across different mindsets alluded to by Gorchakov whilst interacting with Domenico. The theme has been traced back to Russia's long religious and literary tradition during the video essay, and the subject finds one of its sources right back in this much revered work by the famed Russian playwright. It is worth noting additionally that Tarkovsky was a fond admirer of Chekhov, especially due to the Russian dramatist's tendency to get rid of the first page of his stories, so that this would leave the motivations of its characters absent from the introductions, landing its viewers right in the thick of the plot. Similarly, one might be tempted to assert that, like Chekhov, Tarkovsky removes pages of his films in a metaphorical sense, especially in Zerkalo, so that the viewer is then left with the raw impressions and narrative fragments that, albeit handled less straightforwardly than his industry counterparts, naturally allow his unique approach to filmmaking to emerge, one which seeds with ontological and metaphysical enigmas, one which thrives in a pervasive oneiric mood, where the meaning behind the actions of its characters may seem opaque, mystifying even at times, but which after a first encounter organically unfolds, the more one emotionally invests himself in it, and once one opens the door and let the work in all its luminous glory, to enticingly permeate one's mind. This scene with Maria waiting by the fence and the meeting with the doctor, together with the following images that surge while Maria returns to the dacha under Arseny's poem, recited by the poet himself, all happened prior to the war, when the children are very young and should be taken as memories from Maria. It is worth noting that Tarkovsky held his father in high regard, and it was known that as a teenager he was closer to him than to his mother. He would spend as much time with him as possible discussing books, shuffling and listening to his record collection, of which Bach would become a favorite and to be featured heavily in this film, and listening to Arseny read his own poetry, hence his decision to have him recite his own poems in Zerkalo could not have been more natural. The aforementioned poem, named First Meetings, describes that almost inexpressible and intoxicating sense of bliss one feels when ravished by utter, boundless, genuine love, and is therefore aptly placed at a moment when Maria is longing for her husband, while the products of their love, their children, are presented in their most radiant innocence. In it, rendezvous and moments spent together between the couple are described as giving the impression that no one else existed besides them both there and then, and also as having been celebrated as the epiphany, the event where Christ is acknowledged as the Son of God and his embodiment in the physical realm, one of the most important religious dates and holidays in Russia. The poet proceeds to describe their rapture, evoking the grace, lightness and dynamism of their swirling movement, as she brings him into her realm, mentioned as existing in the other side of the mirror. Disregarding the characteristic penchant and typical significance of mirrors and reflected images so conspicuously present in Tarkovsky's career and which acquired specific narrative relevance and nostalgia, as observed in the former in-depth study, this is perhaps the closest one will get to a verbal reference to the film itself, and immediately sheds light into the meaning behind the title of the work, as a foray into the world of Maria, Tarkovsky's mother, to which this work has been dedicated and inspired by, as examined in earlier parts of this video essay. During the second half of the poem, the poet refers to a point when, after awakening to the absolute realization of what it meant to have her with him, as both belonged to one another equally and undividedly, beyond rational means or conceptualization, the word thou acquired an altogether different significance, comparing it to the foremost title of kingship possible. It's hard not to think about Martin Buber's relational philosophy expounded in his marvelous book, often considered his masterwork, named I and Thou, in which the possibilities of love's manifestation and the connection between the self and another is brought to a depth that finds appear perhaps only in Rumi's mystical verse. An excerpt from Buber's I and Thou ensues. Whoever says thou does not have something for his object. Thou has no borders. Whoever says thou does not have something, he has nothing, but he stands in relation. The relation to the thou is unmediated. Nothing conceptual intervenes between I and thou, no prior knowledge and no imagination, and memory itself is changed as it plunges from particularity into wholeness. Feelings one has, love occurs. Feelings dwell in man, but man dwells in his love. This is no metaphor but actuality. Love does not cling to an I, as if the thou were merely its content or object. It is between I and thou. Whoever does not know this, who does not know this with his being, does not know love, even if he should ascribe to it the feelings that he lives through, experiences, enjoys, and expresses. Love is a cosmic force. The underlying idea behind such description of the thou in Martin Buber's thought finds itself paralleled in Arseny Tarkovsky's poem, in the sense that once thou is recognized in its purest, essential meaning, as the poem's narrator does, the relationship between I and thou, between the poet and his companion, transforms the world, or at least the conception one previously held of it in astounding ways. The complete poem will be left in the description box for those interested in it. Despite the ominous and sharp closing lines on the ruthless nature of fate, which thoroughly succeed as an exhortation to a mindful perspective on time and being, it's an incredibly beautiful poem that, particularly towards the end section, tells the viewer of the transfigured universe presented to the couple's eyes, and a sense of magical, perhaps even supernatural harmony amidst the novelty of unforeseen elemental changes that arise by association, following the tone of the preceding sequence, whose absorbing poignancy is expertly synced in the end with Maria's affecting emotional release. In this part 3 of the in-depth study of Zerkalo, we have begun a proper examination of elements from the narrative, which, although stretching across the first quarter of an hour only, have provided a wealth of content and assorted interpretation, therefore immediately validating the film's reputation as a bountiful, rich, and meaningful work of art. In the upcoming parts, we'll continue to probe together Zerkalo's abundant pabulum, highlighting the themes weaved by the characters and scenes, rescuing historic and literary references from obscurity, relating them to Tarkovsky's life and thought, effectively getting to know Zerkalo on an extensive personal level and putting it into a broader perspective, so that each viewer may supply its already established emotional connection with a more informed understanding of its formal features. Hopefully you have enjoyed these essays so far. Stay tuned for the continuation to come out in the near future. As always, thank you for listening and see you next time.